Welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to talk all about pressing instructions in your pattern and some things to consider and kind of best practices surrounding that. So the first question when we talk about pressing is always, do you press open or to the side, right? What do you write the instructions for your pattern for? Now, this is largely a matter of preference, but there are some precision implications here that you kind of want to think about as a pattern writer, especially if you're dealing with a little bit more complex pattern that's intermediate or advanced. My preference personally is always to press open, and the reason for that is because it ends up being more precise. What I have here showing you is a very close-up image of a seam pressed open, and you can see that the tension on that folded fabric is the same, right? That seam's going to end up right down the middle between those two pieces of fabric because the tension on them is exactly the same to each side. It's balanced, right? When you press that seam to one side, you have one piece of fabric that's going to get folded back on itself, and then the other one gets pushed underneath the one on the other side, right? That's the beauty of pressing seams open, is that you kind of get this overlap of the fabric that some people think makes the seam stronger. I have my own opinions about that, but I will not get into that right now. The reason this matters for precision is because the tension on those two pieces of fabric is not the same. You've got one that's going to get sucked underneath the other. And what that means is that you can't always guarantee that your seam's going to end up directly in between those two pieces. It's really easy to kind of have that top seam folded out beyond the seam. So you have your little seam and then you've got this lip of fabric that sticks out beyond it. When that happens, your pieces are now no longer the size that they were intended to be because your seam allowance is effectively not a 1/4 inch anymore. And for really precise patterns, this can add up drastically. It's the same thing as working with a scant 1/4 inch versus a regular 1/4 inch. These kind of little itty bitty bits of things that are not precise just kind of compound over the course of building up a whole quilt pattern until you end up with something that's really problematic and really hard to sew together. So if I'm doing a really precise pattern or you're sewing sort of a more intermediate advanced pattern, I would really strongly recommend that you instruct people to press those seams open. And you can even have a section in your pattern as to why you are encouraging this, because a lot of people have strong feelings about open versus to the side, and they don't want to change that opinion, right? But very few people actually understand the pros and cons of each. Now, to the side can be very helpful for kind of beginner patterns. It tends to be a little bit quicker, though it just depends on how you prefer to press, if you're using a seam roller or something along those lines. But more importantly, for beginner patterns, it makes it really easy to nest all of the seams. So when you're sewing rows together on a block with a bunch of units that are coming together, they kind of lock together and it's much easier to get alignment that way. But again, that's relying on the fact that all of your pieces are the same size, which if you're sewing really complex patterns with a lot of seams and you're pressing to the side, you've got this kind of distortion happening to where those pieces are not the same size anymore, and you can't use nesting to lock those seams together. So again, this is mostly a matter of preference, but there are some implications for precision. So understand what the pros and cons of each are before you make a decision for your pattern, but these are just things to consider when you're thinking about what instructions you're going to write in your pattern. Other things to consider are kind of balancing simplicity in your instructions versus seam flatness. So pressing seams open generally leads to really nice flat seams, but pressing seams to one side, like we already talked about, can help you nest those seams and get better alignment for relatively simple blocks. Now, I've also seen some patterns that are, more or less including pressing to the side instructions, and then you get to certain parts of the block which tend to be symmetric, and basically half the units need to be pressed one way and the other half need to be pressed the opposite way. And so you end up with units that were otherwise identical getting split into these piles. That adds a layer of complexity to your pattern. Maybe it's worth it to you, maybe it's not, but that's something to think about, right? If you've got to keep track of left and right units because of the seam pressing direction on the back, that is a lot to keep track of in a pattern and may just not be worth it for a beginner pattern or something along those lines. I also see some patterns that instruct spinning seams. Spinning a seam is basically where you have kind of 4 patches coming together. You will unpick the 1/4 inch seam allowance of one horizontal seam, and that allows you to kind of get all of the seam allowances that are pressed in one direction kind of pressed in a clockwise direction or counterclockwise direction, so that they're all going the same way. This helps with flatness, but again, that is a level of complexity that maybe you don't want in your pattern, and I would argue most quilters probably don't want to deal with. This is mostly something that they're going to do if they like doing it to any pattern, whether or not it instructs it, and they're not going to do even if it instructs it just because they don't like doing it. But again, every level of complexity that you add, you want to make sure you have a reason for it and make sure it's worthwhile to your reader. Otherwise, it just becomes this annoyance to them. And the more of those things you have, the less likely they are to enjoy your pattern and come back for more. Other things to consider are that some units always need to get pressed one direction, right? So curve seams are one of the ones that people think fall into this category. I tend to challenge that a little bit. If you're dealing with really, really small curved units that have a really small radius, okay, maybe, the curve seam always goes to the outside just because that's where it's going to be easiest to kind of get the tension off that curve seam so it's not affecting how the block lays. But on larger radius curves, you can really go either direction. It doesn't matter. Flying geese are one that, again, can go either direction, but both seams need to go each direction. So if you're pressing out towards the triangles, they both need to go out towards the triangles, and that's because of this little intersection point, right? You're going to get basically a bunch of layers of fabric building up there, and it's really hard to get them to lie flat if one's going one way and the other one's going the other way. Likewise, you can press both towards kind of that inner goose triangle. That's fine too, but again, you don't really want to have one seam going one way and the other going the other way because it just leads to really, really thick buildup in some areas and difficult pressing. The ones that you really, really need to be careful of are skinny pieces, and what I mean by that are ones that finish at 1/4 inch or less. This doesn't happen too often. Most people steer clear of piecing this tiny in their patterns, but occasionally you will see a piece that is cut at basically 3/4 inch wide for some of these more complex picture piecing patterns. And when you take 1/4 inch away from each side of that seam, you're going to end up with something that's 1/4 inch thick altogether, right? And if your seam allowance is 1/4 inch and you try to press it both towards that piece, you're going to end up with seam allowances overlapping each other. And that makes for a really, really thick seam, especially if you're pressing to one side, because you're going to have, basically 5 fabrics piled up one on top of each other on an already very skinny piece. It just leads to a lot of tension in that piece, and you're going to end up seeing some bubbling on the front of your quilt top as well. So any kind of skinning piecing like that, you always want to press away from those skinny pieces or open. So let's talk about how you kind of write these pressing instructions and keep track of what you've written, especially if you're pressing to one side. Doesn't really apply if you're pressing all your seams open, because you're pressing all your seams open no matter what, and it really doesn't matter. When you're pressing to one side, though, you do have to keep track of this because it's very easy to end up with seams that end up very, very thick, which is not ideal. That's part of why you're including these pressing to the side instructions instead of just letting people figure it out or always pressing to the dark side, whatever that happens to be in their fabric. Because depending on what fabrics they choose and what placement they end up with, they could end up with very, very, very thick seams. So one way to do this is obviously to sew a test block. You do it yourself. You write down the directions that you pressed and kind of figure it out as you go along, and then just document that in your pattern. But me personally, I write most of my patterns without having to sew a test block because I don't like a lot of just kind of like orphan blocks floating around my sewing room, but it's also, there are some kind of digital ways to keep track of these things that are very easy. And the primary way that I do that is to use arrows on your diagrams, even if you don't end up putting them into the pattern itself. So a lot of the patterns that I write, you will actually see things like you see on the left here, where you have little yellow arrows that kind of indicate the pressing direction as you have your assembly diagrams. That's a great way to do it. I encourage doing that and putting it in your pattern itself because, again, most quilters are visual, and that's really helpful to kind of see what they need to do. But even if you don't want to do that, you just want to write it in the instructions, doing this on kind of your assembly diagrams as you're drawing them out in Illustrator or Affinity Designer, whatever graphics program that you happen to be using, can help you kind of visualize and keep track of these things as you're writing the pattern to make sure that you don't end up with a seam that's pressed the wrong direction that kind of causes a really big problem for your reader. And it's really easy to do in most graphics programs as well. You just kind of drop the arrows there, and when you export, you can just omit those arrows and it ends up perfectly fine. It also helps you really visualize as the block's coming together. You can see if you've got a bunch of arrows all pointing towards the same location, which is going to result in a really thick seam. Again, a picture's worth 1,000 words, so the more you can help yourself and other people visualize what's happening, the better off everyone's going to be. Alrighty, that's all I've got for you today. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next time for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!